It's so nice. Thank you, Rabbi, for the introduction, and thank you. It's so nice to see so many familiar faces, friendly, familiar faces, and it's so nice to be back at 1449 Life. And it's only right. This is what my father would want, right? That we should learn Torah on a Sunday morning. This was his time, Sunday morning. He used to do it earlier than 11 o'clock, right? He did it at 10 o'clock probably. We probably should be sitting in the other room, and he probably should be, we should probably be sitting on the couch and be doing his thing, opening his book. But we'll imagine it like that, and we'll take it from there. What I want to do today is I want to look at a halachic question. But I want to look at it through the prism of the history of American Orthodoxy and the life of Ben Mintz. This is my father's fourth yahrzeit. He died on Zion Iyar 2021, right? Tufshin Peyah. So this is his fourth yahrzeit. And it's wonderful. This is the way he would, like to be remembered. And that is in the yeshiva, in the Beis Medrash, that it was in our home where he taught so many years and where we grew up, and that spirit of Yiddishkeit, that spirit of Torah continues. And the idea that the orthodoxy evolves over this past century. That's really that was his life, how American Orthodoxy evolved. So let's look at the following question and see it through that prism. And that's the question of converting children. So the Gemara tells us that in order to convert to Judaism, a woman needs two things and a man needs three things. A woman requires Kabbalat mitzvot, which is accepting of the commandments, acceptance of Judaism, and going to the mikvah. A man also needs a bris. The Gemara is concerned about the following question. In order to convert to Judaism, you need to accept the mitzvot. What happens if we want to convert a child who's too young to understand what the significance of the mitzvot is? Can you convert children? So actually, this is not a question that we made up. It's a question that's brought up in the beginning of the Gemara in Masechet Ketubot. And the Mishnah tells us, the first source, Hagiyoras v'hashvuya v'hashivcha sheniftu v'shenizgayru v'shenishtakru. Says the Giyoras, so I just kind of focus on the piece that's important to us. A female convert who converts, Husos mibno shalosh shanim yomecha, when she is younger than 3 years old, Suvasa, her ksuva is 200. What in the world does that mean? So we know there's a rule. The rule is that a basula, that a virgin, gets a ksuva that's 200 zus. A woman who is suspected of not being a virgin, her ksuva is only 100 zus. Now, a woman who converts to Judaism, her ksuva is only 100 zus because we're not sure about her sexual activity pre-conversion. Now, what happens if a woman converts when she's less than 3 years old? Well, you're pretty sure about her sexual activity pre-conversion because she was only 2 years old, right? So therefore, it says the Mishnah, her ksuba would be 200 because she clearly is still a basula. She's still a virgin when she becomes Jewish, and therefore she gets a ksuba of 200. Okay, that's what the Mishnah says. What does that have to do with us? Amar Ravuna ger katan matbilin oso al daspes. So what do you see from that Mishnah? You see from that Mishnah that it's possible to convert when you're under 3 years old. How can you convert when you're under 3 years old? You can't accept the mitzvot when you're under 3 years old. So Rav Huna says that ger katan, a child convert, is converted al das bezdin. What's al das bezdin mean? Meaning the acceptance of the mitzvot is done by the bezdin, by the court, by the parents, by the court/parents, right? They accept the mitzvot for my kamash. What do you learn from here? What do you learn from here? That it is a merit, it's a privilege to convert to Judaism. See, what's the problem? So the court actually, represents the acceptance of the mitzvot, or stands in for the fact that the child can't accept the mitzvot on his or her own. So they're doing something for the sake of the child. What's the rule? Can I do something for you even though you don't know about it? For instance, so Rabbi Shmuel sells the chametz in Erev Pesach. And all of a sudden, on the second day of Chol HaMoed, you remember, I forgot to click the link that sends the chametz form to the rabbi so that he can include my chametz in the sale of chametz, right? So what happens? Do you own all your chametz? So luckily you don't. Why? Because when the rabbi and the rabbis sell the chametz, they say, and we'll hear all the forms, and here's all the names of all the people, and there might be somebody who forgot to send in their form. How do we know that, right? Jeff, you didn't send in your form. How do I know you want to send in your form? Maybe you don't want to send in your form. No. We can do you a favor. We assume that you want to do the right thing. And we assume that if you realize you hadn't sent in your form, you would want me to send to mention your name. So if I'm allowed to do you a favor, even though you don't know that I'm doing you a favor, I can assume that you want me to do you a favor. Okay? That makes sense. So too, the Bezdin, the parents, can step in for the child's convert and say that the child will be brought up in a Jewish atmosphere, and the child doesn't even understand what that means. Doesn't matter. Zachin la'adam shalom. Amar Rabbi Yosef, the last line, he gedilu, when the child comes of age, or about mitzvah, yicholim limchos. They have the right to say, now I am of age, and I prefer Jesus. Right? I don't like my Judaism. I don't want to convert. I don't want to convert. Okay? It doesn't happen that way, right? Usually you just say, do you like your life the way it is? And of course they say, we love our life. I mean, they're 12 and 13 years old. No 12 and 13-year-old says, I love my life exactly. But in principle, they love their life, and therefore they want to continue the way they are, and all is good. But in theory, in theory, the bet did or their parents step in for them, but when they come of age, they have the right to say that we don't want to be Jewish anymore. Okay, so that's the Gemara. That has been the rule for basically 2,000 years, right? 1,500 years. That we convert children. And we convert children all over the place, right? That's an adopted child. That's 100 different ways that we convert for 100 different reasons we convert children. And those conversions are all acceptable, and they are Jewish according to the Talmud. Now, this interestingly became a topic of discussion in the history of American Orthodoxy. And I want to look at today two tshuvos from the works of Rabbi Feinstein. Rabbi Feinstein was born in Lithuania, and he came to the United. He was a rabbi in Lithuania. He came to the United States in 1937. This is going to be important in a second. He came to the United States in 1937. It was basically because of pressure from the Soviets. It became difficult to live in Russia. So he came with his family. They moved to the Lower East Side. He moved to FDR Drive. Is that what they call it, FDR Drive? On the Lower East Side, in one of those big buildings. If you ever take my father would always want to tell you, he said, if you take the East Side Highway downtown, and you look when you're going downtown, you look on the right-hand side of the highway. So there are a couple of big buildings on FDR Drive, and that's where the Feinsteins lived for half a century. And he was the Rosh Yeshiva of what they call MTJ, Mesivta Tiferes Yerushalayim. That yeshiva still exists on the Lower East Side. Now that yeshiva is like the Lower East Side, not exactly the center of Torah Judaism, but it still exists. But in 1937, when the Jews lived on the Lower East Side, that was the center of Orthodox Judaism, of Torah Judaism. And you know, Moshe Feinstein, they always said about Moshe Feinstein, when you got your smicha, on the back of your smicha, Moshe Feinstein's phone number was written. Right? So people went to Moshe Feinstein, and it was the Torah community in 1937 was small. They say, I have no idea what this is. My father would say, when the legend becomes fact, print the legend. So the legend is that that Moshe Feinstein would go to every yeshiva buffer's wedding. Because in those days, there were so few yeshiva bachrim. When they got married, Moshe Feinstein would go and, would celebrate together with them. So again, whether it's right or wrong, it gives you a sense of what the Torah community looked like. So the first tshuva we're going to look at is a tshuva that was written in the fall of 1940. Okay, first of all, fall of 1940. Ramosha Feinstein has just literally gotten off the boat. He arrives in New York in 1937, right? So he's just getting used to what New York is in 1940. But the fall of 1940 is also important because Ben Mintz celebrated his bar mitzvah on Parsha Shoftim, which was probably the end of August. We can find that exactly. I forgot to Google it. But whatever, Parsha Shoftim was the end of August, the beginning of Elul in 1940. I'll tell you that we have his bar mitzvah obviously was in the Talmud Torah Flatbush. That was my grandfather's shul, and they had the event, the lunch, kind of the event exactly. They had the Shabbos lunch down the street at a hall, which he always used to show us when we went to Flatbush. It's not a hall anymore, but then it was a hall. What's funny is that in recent years, we found my grandmother's, she put together some kind of memoir, and included in the memoir was my father's pshetel from his bar mitzvah. And the funny thing is that the pshetel, first of all, was written on stationery from a hotel in the Catskills. Summer before, they had gone to the Catskills and someone had studied the pshetel with them. But the funny thing about the pshetel is that the Torah part of the pshetel was written in Yiddish. And you know, my father, he would always tell you he didn't know Yiddish, but you knew it wasn't true. You knew that at some point in his life, he knew Yiddish, or, that was just the way they communicated, or at least the Torah way they communicated. So anyway, his pshetel in 1940 was written in Yiddish. So 1940, right? The world is at war. The United States was thinking about joining the war. Ramosha Feinstein just joins the American Orthodox community, and he gets a question from his brother-in-law. His brother-in-law seems to have been a rabbi in Toledo, Ohio. I don't know much about him, but he was a rabbi in Toledo, Ohio. And he writes about what the rules of conversion are. And obviously you can imagine Toledo, Ohio in 1940, you can come up with these issues of conversion. And Ramosha Feinstein at the end of the tshuva talks about how you should deal with a gerkut, with a child who's converted to Judaism. Look on the bottom of the first column here on the next page, right? The second page. It's just in blue. Achnokon hadavar kishiyandiel lahatbilo od hakam legeus bifnei des. He says, I think, says Ramosha Feinstein, when the child, the boy, reaches bar mitzvah, or the girl reaches bat mitzvah, you should immerse them in the mikveh a second time. Why? You see, why are you Jewish? Why is a child who converts Jewish? Because because the betin, rabbis, the parents stand in the place of the child and do the child a favor by allowing him to convert to Judaism to be part of the Jewish people. Says Ramosha Feinstein, it's all based on the fact that I do you a favor. But what's the favor? You convert into an Orthodox family. In Ramosha Feinstein's mind, in the fall of 1940, the Orthodox families in America were not very nice. They were families who didn't keep Shabbos properly. They were families who didn't keep Yom Tov properly. They're families who didn't keep, didn't observe kashrus properly. So what happens? So you get converted into this family. You grow up in this family. Now, if you weren't Jewish and you went to McDonald's, that's fine. You're not Jewish. There's no problem. But if you're Jewish and you go to McDonald's, if you're converted and then you grow up in a family that goes to McDonald's, then what? Then that's a problem, right? You get a big X up in heaven because you violated the law by eating a cheeseburger. So says Ramosha Feinstein, you should put the person back into the mikveh when they grow up. Why? Because I don't know that we actually did them a favor by converting them. The whole thing was you're allowed to do a favor for somebody. But this wasn't a favor because they have so many X's up in heaven because they grew up in a family that supposedly was Orthodox but wasn't really Orthodox. So they would have been better if they weren't Orthodox. So they weren't Jewish, sorry. So therefore, we didn't do them a favor by converting. That's what he says. Kevan shebabanosenu harabim karov shechas v'shalom lo yishmar Shabbos b'chadome odisur, because they're not going to keep Shabbos, and therefore we're not doing them a favor. That's what Ramosha Feinstein says. So first of all, I know that's surprising. That's not surprising. Obviously, Ramosha Feinstein thought that. Ramosha Feinstein comes from Luban in Lithuania. again, that's also the legend becomes fact. Not everybody in Lithuania was as frum as we'd like to think they were. But that's what we think, so that's all that matters, right? The image, especially for the rabbis who came to the Treifa Medina, was that, in the Altahaim, right, in the home, in the old country, everybody was Orthodox. Came to America, and everybody violates Shabbos. So that's the way Moshe Feinstein looks at it. You become converted into an Orthodox family in America. That's not a good conversion. But then Moshe Feinstein, almost like you hear his mind working. But it's possible that it still is a privilege to convert. Even if they're not religious, it's good to convert. Because even the Jewish sinners are better than being not Jewish. Right? Okay, now, from our perspective, we're already so sophisticated about this. We say we don't like that. It's not nice, right? But from Moshe Feinstein's perspective, it actually is nice. Because what he's saying is that, the Jewish sinners, but at least you're Jewish, right? He says that it's also good, it's good to be part of a Jewish family. Even if your father's not so religious, but, he comes from a religious tradition. Again, this is Moshe Feinstein, 1930 to 1940. Everybody comes from a religious tradition. So it's good to become part of that tradition. He says that especially if his mother can, right, why is the kid not Jewish? Because the mother's not Jewish. But Moshe Feinstein says, but if the child converts with the mother and he's part of a Jewish family, that's only good to be part of a Jewish family. So Moshe Feinstein says, at the end of this, he says, just the last line, he says, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if it is a privilege, 1940, I'm not sure if it is a privilege to be converted as a child or it's not a privilege. It's not a privilege because the family's not really religious. But it is a privilege because it's good to be Jewish. He says, I'm not sure which is right or wrong. So you know what? When the kid grows up, put the kid back in the mix. Now, what does that sound like? It sounds like, what's the big deal? Put the kid back in the mikvah. Of course, they never put the kid back in the mikvah, right? Because, that's the whole purpose of converting a child when the child is a child is that they grow up as Jewish and they like their Judaism, they like their family, and everything's fine. If you create a trauma when they become bar bat mitzvah, they have to start going back to the mikvah and think whether they like their Judaism, you're not going to get anywhere. So he kind of writes it. I can't believe that anybody ever did this. But it's interesting to just listen to Rav Moshe Feinstein, the way he's thinking about this issue. Okay? Fall of 1940. Now, the second tshuva. The second tshuva is written in the summer of 1974. It's written to a rabbi in Indianapolis. Okay? Indianapolis. I need to just tell you a piece of history of Orthodox Indianapolis. In 1971, Rabbi Ronald Gray, a Ritz Musma, came to Indianapolis. He became the rabbi of the Orthodox Shul in Indianapolis, and he founded a elementary school, a yeshiva day school. There was a wealthy family in Indianapolis. That family still is around. They're called the Haston family. They're involved in Turo. They were one of Dr. Lander's big supporters, Haston. Anyway, it was called the Haston Hebrew Academy of Indianapolis. It was founded in 1971. In 1974, there were 56 students, K-8, in the Haston Hebrew Academy of Indianapolis. The teachers were mostly shluchim from Israel. By the way, that was true in Washington, D.C. also, back in the days when the Hebrew Academy was down the street on Rock Creek Ford Road. And the teachers were all shluchim. I remember that my bar mitzvah teacher was Mr. Schechter. Mr. Schechter was a shliach from Israel. They lived in Summit Hill. I used to go to Summit Hill for my bar mitzvah lessons. And he was a nice Orthodox shliach. And he was an Israeli who came for a couple of years. I mean, I have no idea what happened to him. I'm sure everything was good. But I mean, he taught me about bar mitzvah lessons. That was who the teachers were in Hebrew Academy of Washington too. Because you couldn't, those were the days before the people were educated, before people went into Jewish education, especially out of New York. So they used to get these shluchim to come. So they were the teachers in Indianapolis. 20% of the students are Shomer Shabbos. Okay, so 20% are observant, 80% are not observant. Those numbers were better in the Hebrew Academy of Washington. They were stronger for Shabbos in those days. I was thinking about it today, driving down. My class was at least 60% Orthodox, right? There was a whole strong Orthodox community. There were plenty of non-Orthodox in the community, right? 1975, I graduated. Yeah, that 1975 is when I graduated. So graduated, ninth grade. So 1976 is when see, I've been away too long. I forgot that in Washington you go through ninth grade. Do they still do that? Does the school still go through ninth grade? Oh, they changed that. In my day, they used it. The Hebrew Academy went through ninth grade. High school was only 10, 11, and 12 here in Washington. So anyway, I was in eighth grade in 1975. About 60% of my class was Orthodox. In Indianapolis, about 20% of the students were Orthodox. Now, one halakha you have to know before we read this tshuva, and that is, what does the Gemara say about non-Jews learning Torah? This isn't exactly what we follow today. But what does the Gemara say about non-Jews learning Torah? Can't do it. They can't do it. That's correct. Nakri shalama Torah chayavus. Right? A non-Jew is not allowed to learn Torah. Where did they derive that from? Torah tziva lanu, Moshe. Okay? That Moshe taught us the Torah, the Jews, but not to the non-Jews. Now, we'll have to save that for a future Yurtzeit lecture about what that means and how we interpret it. But for now, we have to just keep on that, right? Jews learn Torah, non-Jews are not supposed to learn. Ramosha Feinstein was asked a question about this Hasted Hebrew Academy. Next page, Gimels. Uvidavar shebebeis hasefer hayomi. That's funny that he calls it Beis HaSefer Hayomi. That means the day school, right? Shenityased al yedei b'nei Torah v'yirei Hashem yispark. Right? That was created by Orthodox people. He likes them. V'amenahel v'hamorim kulam yireim u'shleim. And the teachers are all religious. V'nodu sheharbe talmidim heimi nafrio shenisgairu etzel ha-reform etzel ha-conservativity. She'eno klum. Here's the crisis. The crisis is like this. There are 56 students in the school. A good number of them, he doesn't tell you the number, but a good number of them, their mothers have a conservative or reformed conversion. So they think they're Jewish, but they're not really Jewish. Now, what's the problem? How can you be teaching non-Jews Torah? That's his crisis. Again, whether it is a crisis or it's not a crisis is not interesting to me right now. That to him, that's a crisis. What are we supposed to do? So look what he says. He says, you can't throw him out of the school. Why can't you throw him out of the school? 56 students. If you throw half of them out of the school, you don't have a school anymore. He's very practical. I'm sure they said their own Shabbat. You can't throw them out of the school. What are we going to do? Right? So you can't throw them out. So he says, so all the teachers have to quit. That's a remarkable question. That was crazy, right? So all the teachers have to quit because they're in violation of a law. So maybe all the teachers should quit. So look at your emotions. This is just interesting. It's not what I'm interested in, but this is fascinating, right? I can't say anything absolutely about this. It's something that that involves their livelihood. He says to ask him to give up their livelihood for this. He says, obviously this question has never been asked before. He says, I would never have a chutzpah to tell them to leave. That's also amazing, right? I don't know the details of such laws. I would never tell anybody to give up their job because they're teaching kids who think they're Jewish, but they're not really Jewish. I mean, what kind of crazy case is that? You can't tell them to leave their job. The Hochim of Beit HaSefer Lilmon Mitam Shumase Yahadus Lekais. See, he explains it. Then we'll get to the conversion piece. He says, "Come on, Goy Shalom on Torah is Chayim, right? Whatever that means. But these kids are not going Shalom HaTorah. These kids are in the school because what? Because they're Jewish. Now, we may not accept their mother's conversion, but they're not in the school saying, ha, my mother doesn't have a good conversion and we're still in the school. Obviously not. They're in the school because they're Jewish, because they're brought up as Jews. Their parents believe that they're Jewish, and therefore they're in the school. So you can tell a teacher not to teach them Torah, not to teach these kids Torah, who so much believe that they're Jewish that they actually are going to the Indianapolis Hebrew Academy because there's a technicality that they're not Jewish. And Moshe says, that's impossible. Obviously you can teach them. But what do you do? Half the school is not Jewish. And you should know that this isn't the only place this happens. Someone told me over the weekend that in Budapest, they have a school and they have the same crisis. There's a whole large group of students who brought up Jewish, but they're, for whatever reason, the conversion is no good. And like what are they going to do, right? How are they going to deal with this issue? It's interesting, even today in 2025, to have such an issue. Skip to that. We can go through the whole thing, but let's for the sake of the people who are going to Italy, let's go to the Bible. He says, let's go up 15 lines. So he says, Aval ha'efshar l'tagli. He says, maybe we can solve this problem. De'es ha'ketanim yigayu, sorry. That maybe we can convert these children. Ki einam srichos habalas mitzvos v'yigayrum al das bezdin. He says they're children, so we don't need their consent. The principal of the school can decide that it's good for them to convert. We'll have a mikveh day. We'll take all the kids to the mikveh. I guess we'll take the Jewish kids and the non-Jewish kids to the mikveh. The kids will be Jewish, and everything will be fine. Remember Ramosha Feinstein of 1940. Ramosha Feinstein of 1940 wasn't so sure about that little trick, right? Ramosha Feinstein of 1940 wasn't sure that that was a privilege, that we were doing the kids a favor by converting them. But here he says, let's take them en masse. Let's take them all to the mikveh, right? He says, Kimi kevan shalomdim bebeit sefer dati. They learn in a religious school. Eitzel morim yirei shamayim, with teachers who are religious. Hare matzoy sheyitzgadlu leo shomrei Torah. Shalachem shafshu safek huskos vada. Wow. He says, this isn't 1940 anymore, right? They're learning in yeshiva day school. I don't know how they're going to grow up, but at least they have a shot to grow up. For sure, it's a schluss. For sure, it's a merit for them. It's a privilege that we're letting them learn in the yeshiva day school, and only good things are going to happen from that. V'gam af im lo yiskadlu leo shomrei Torah. Mistaber shu schluss de rishe Yisrael sheish lam kushas Yisrael u'mitzvah sham sha'osim u'mitzvah ve'averos hu lahem kishkaga u'gam kein schluss milios no. Now he has the thing that he said the last two, that even Jewish sinners are better than non-Jews. So that's a whole interesting thing. Let's think. I want to look at the last piece in a second. But here you see something fascinating. Ramosha Feinstein writes in 1974, let's just take the kids to the mikveh. In 1940, he wasn't so sure. But what changed? Ramosha changed. I'm sure Ramosha became, learned to appreciate American Orthodoxy in those 35 years, for sure. But what also changed was the reality of American Orthodoxy. What do you mean the reality of American Orthodoxy? In 1940, he was worried that these kids were going to public school, right? 1940, there wasn't much. They were going to public school. They weren't being brought up in Orthodox homes, really. And therefore, was it a schluss or wasn't a schluss? Was it a privilege or wasn't a privilege? He wasn't sure. But in 1974, the question is a different question. He's being asked this question by the principal for kids who are actually studying in a yeshiva day school. How can you do better than that? You have non-Jewish kids studying in yeshiva day school who think they're Jewish. Where Moshe Feinstein understands, we have to solve this problem. The problem is not their problem. The problem is our problem. And that's where we were in 1974, right? 1974, let's just remember for a minute. My father would say, let's just take it back for a second to the Second World War, right? After the Second World War, you had the conservative movement really became the American Jewish religion, right? Famously, the Jewish sociologist in 1950, Marshall Sclair, said that the future of Judaism in America is the conservative movement. There was no question about it. Those were the decades of JTS and suburban community schools, right? The family that prays together, stays together, mechitzas went away. Then all of a sudden, there was a switch, maybe related in part to the decision by the conservative movement that you could drive to shoot. That and the centrality of Israel after the Six-Day War, that's a whole other fascinating discussion. But whatever it was, the Orthodox that had kind of leaned to conservative in the 50s and 60s, by the 70s and 80s, they're leaning back to Orthodox, right? And that's really the beginning of what we call today kind of Rabbi Soloveitchik Orthodoxy, YU Orthodoxy, and then, once it all played itself out, what we call modern. That was the beginning of modern Orthodoxy, of Orthodoxy being able to integrate with America, right? With America Public Square, with American people, right? This was my father's whole life, were those decades in which American Orthodoxy kind of struggled to find its place, right? And that was the struggle. There were those who believed that we had to be, had to be rigid in the old ways, and there was no room for movement. And there were those who went too far in terms of our integration, right? And the question was finding that middle ground. And now, now we fight the good fight in so many different things. But now, let's just say one thing. Now we're on firm foundation. Orthodoxy is solid in America. We know that Orthodoxy isn't going to disappear in America, and then we fight all the important fights that we fight. But it's all with the understanding that whether we're right or we're wrong, Orthodoxy is not going to suffer, right? Orthodoxy is strong in America. In 1974, that wasn't true, right? We all know that's not true, right? In 1974, we weren't sure exactly what Orthodoxy in America was going to look like. So the people who fought the good fight in those decades, there was a lot more at risk in 1974 in a certain sense. And Moshe Feinstein understands that, right? You say, well, Feinstein, right? The Rosh Hashiva, what does he know about this stuff? No, they don't understand that. Moshe Feinstein was fighting these battles. He understood it. You have a school in Indianapolis. You have an Orthodox community in Indianapolis, and a good portion of the school are kids whose mothers don't have Orthodox conversions. It's not their problem. It's our problem. We need to create Orthodox communities in places like Indianapolis, in places like Shepherd Park. We need to create those communities. What are we going to do to create those communities? So the fact that it's a privilege to convert these kids, it's not only a privilege to convert these kids, it's a privilege for the Indianapolis Orthodox community to have these kids Jewish and to have a school with these kids. You have to understand that. And Moshe Feinstein understands that. And that's why the tshuva looks so different than the tshuva does in 1940. That's why when you read these tshuvos, you have to read them understanding where they come from. Right now, people have written PhD dissertations on the history of tshuvos through the centuries. It's a lot harder to try to understand what was going on in Amsterdam in the year 1600 than it is what was going on in Indianapolis in 1974, right? We know what was going on in Indianapolis. That's why, in a way, this is more fun, right? So that's what Moshe Feinstein says. And look at the last piece, which is just the most amazing of all 5 lines in the bottom. He says that the kids, the parents will be happy to have their kids go to the mikvah. Again, it's good for everybody for the kids to go to the mikvah. Now, this last couple of lines is remarkable. And then, you have a school, K to 8. So there are some kids, K to 8, right, in 7th and 8th grade, who are 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, who are above bar and bat mitzvah. They're not their cotton, right? They're adults. So to have them convert is more complicated because you have to ask them and you have to teach them and all those kinds of things. He says, the boys who are older than 13 and the girls who are older than 12, V'gam hagedolos mibenos yud gim yud beis, vadai yitratzu. I'm sure that they'll want to convert. Uvazet sarich lishtadel. And we have to try to convert the older ones as well. V'chamuvan lahasbir hadavar bofen tov u'benachas shevada yish. And when you try to explain to these 12 and 13-year-olds that they should convert, make sure to tell them in a nice way. You see, Moshe Feinstein, there's not one word there, right? Okay, there's not one word there about the fact that these 12 and 13-year-olds, you better be sure that if they convert to Judaism, that they need to be what? They need to be observant. He's not interested in that. He says, make sure you tell them in a nice way that they're going to be willing to go to the mikveh, right? He understands we're talking about something much bigger. They're in yeshiva. They're in yeshiva. They're in the Hebrew Academy of Indianapolis. We need them to be Jewish. Are they so Orthodox? Are they not so Orthodox? There are a lot of other considerations. This is basically, we're playing, in a sense we would say now, we're playing for the future, right? We're investing in the future. And what they are now is not as important as what the potential could be going forward, both for them and for the generations that come. So what do we have here? In this just small case study of Moshe Feinstein's view about conversion of children in America and the difference of his tshuva between 1940 and 1974. Two different pieces, two different moments in the history of American Orthodoxy. And Moshe Feinstein was very much aware of these two different moments and the movement from one to the other. Today, the rabbis look at this in their own way. But again, we're not anymore in a situation where Orthodox communities are at risk, or we're trying to build Orthodox communities, right? It's a whole different reality. And maybe going back to these tshuvos give us some perspective on how we can deal with issues today as well. And we remember my father, who lived these decades, and he didn't fight the fights in a halachic way. That wasn't his space, that wasn't his area. But in so many different ways, he addressed the issues of the moment in this house, in this room, with this group, and tried to find that balance between orthodoxy, the orthodoxy that allowed him to say his pshetel in 1940 in Yiddish, and the orthodoxy that allowed him to spend his career as a lawyer and a professor and a teacher and all of those things, and to try to find the balance. That's something that we all do, and it's in his memory that we commit ourselves to go forward from year to year. Thank you so much.